Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. When I plan the podcast, I don't usually sit down and look at the subject and how it relates to those episodes around it. Hence, we've often found ourselves in the Pacific in quick succession. In this instance, it seems rather serendipitous. We're going from looking at the fall of France in the last episode to looking at the experiences of German fighter pilots in Europe. The two topics complement each other rather well. But before we kick off, just a quick reminder. This podcast is brought to you by the small donations of listeners like yourself. $1 or $2 each month from each of you goes a long way to helping me find the time to put the show together. The band of loyal listeners do not go unrewarded, no. For instance, I was able to make available to patrons of the show an extra 30 minutes of Robert Forsyth and I discussing the counterfactual question of whether the French could have fought on from North Africa after the fall of France. To find out more on how to become a patron of the show, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast or see the donate page on the website www.2podcast.com. And it's a big thank you to those who support the podcast with a small contribution each month. It really is appreciated. So joining me today is Patrick Eriksson. Patrick is the author of Alarmstart, the German fighter pilot's experience in the Second World War. Since the 1970s, Patrick has been an associate member of the German Air Force Veterans Association, interviewing and corresponding with former members of the Luftwaffe. So thanks for joining me. Shall we start with the pilots themselves? I had an uncle who was in Bomber Command, and he'd been to public school in Britain, which confusingly is private school. I wondered how elite were the German Luftwaffe pilots at the start of the war.
That's a difficult one to answer because the Luftwaffe was a very modern force that had only come into being in the early 1930s. Having no traditions as such of its own, it was quite influenced by Nazism, not so much at the individual person level, but at the medium to higher levels of command. So talent and being properly educated and so on would be seen in a different light within a Nazi framework rather than a normal common sense framework. And I've not seen much information on the background of people and what they'd done before they joined the military. But from what I have seen, they're from an enormous spectrum of backgrounds. The other thing about the German forces generally, and obviously the Luftwaffe, is they have many more non-commissioned ranks than anyone else. They have basically two groups of 3 ranks, which are standard non-coms, and then 1 or 2 more, which are the equivalent of sergeant majors. So below sergeant majors, they've got essentially 6 ranks, whereas most other forces would have 3 or perhaps 4. The one thing the Germans always did, they trained the NCOs much better than anyone else. This is also related, I don't know, shouldn't comment on large-scale issues never having been in the Second World War, but the Germans have this complex about what you might call the kill rate. Whether it's in tanks or infantry on the ground or aeroplanes or submarines, the figures, the numbers, the kill rate is a dominant factor in their thinking and in their tactics and in their battle techniques. And they seem to think, and they have a point, if you're killing more of the enemy than you're losing yourself, you're winning the war. Now, that obviously depends on what sort of numbers and economic power you're fighting. At the end of the day, they were very good at tactics and strangely naive in terms of strategy. Just to take an example like Stalingrad, what they did at Stalingrad in the lead up to Stalingrad, dropping off inferior forces and armies to guard the flanks as they went, that would get you failed in military school. Yet this highly professional officer and General Corps did exactly that and seemed to be blissfully unaware of the danger they were creating. I think every nation has a national approach to the way they fight wars, and the Germans are no exception.
How much was the, I was going to say obsession, how much was the concentration on the NCOs, sort of some sort of, I was going to say problem. It's not a problem. It comes back to the Versailles Treaty of them. Was there some sort of restriction on officers that could get round by having better quality NCOs on a smaller army? Is that where that comes from?
Well, I'm sure you know there's a 100,000 man army. Obviously, if you're restricted to that sort of number, you're gonna be top heavy in terms of officers and specialists, and you're gonna then concentrate on building the framework to enable a rapid expansion when the time comes, which is what Hitler was able to do. I've never read anything that would suggest to me that the NCO Corps was emphasized then. In the First World War, they also had excellent NCO training, and they just kept that tradition going in the Second World War. You know, the NCO path and the officer path and the Luftwaffe was totally separate. Not too many people advanced from the NCO situation into the officer corps. That was fairly uncommon. Unless the person was obtaining a lot of victories or doing something really special, it would not happen very often until the very end of the war, when they were getting short of officers and experts of all kinds, and then all sorts of things became possible.
Were the Germans NCO pilots right from the start?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah, the other thing about the German system, military system, including the Air Force, rank for rank, there was more responsibility and normally more men under command than almost anyone else. Almost a 2-rank difference. So a captain in the German Air Force would have responsibilities and numbers of men and equipment under him equivalent to about a lieutenant colonel in most other forces. And, you know, when you've got a much bigger and stronger NCO corps, then obviously this becomes possible because it goes all the way up the line. And many first pilots on bombers, you know, the commanders on the bombers, would be a fairly middle-ranking NCO, roughly equivalent to a corporal in the Allied systems. The first 3 rank, to put it in English, would be, well, actually, you can't translate all of them into English, but the first 3 ranks would essentially be topped by a lance corporal, and the next 3 would start on what's called an Unteroffizier, an under-officer, which is what Hitler had reached. Most Western systems make that a corporal. And then there's 2 levels of sergeant, and then a sort of equivalent to the American top sergeant, and then your sergeant majors on top of that. So an Unteroffizier is a very common rank for a pilot in all sorts of aircraft, right from the beginning of the war and right through to the end as well.
Yeah, I guess their first operations were Poland, but I mean, presumably, is it the Condor Legion had been blooded in the Spanish Civil War?
Yeah, the Condor Legion, they deliberately pushed their people through there like a sausage machine to expose as many people as possible to about a year of combat time or a year of frontline time, quite deliberately.
Oh, I hadn't realised that it was not a static. So they cycled them through to give as many officers as many pilots as possible and air crews.
They sent them in as private citizens. They basically resigned from the forces on paper and left on civilian ships to Spain in plain clothes and so on and so on. It was a year's contract basically to expose them to combat, and then they had to go home and spread the message in their own units of real combat conditions.
So that means for many of them, their first combat wouldn't have been in Poland, but certainly the first official air operations of the Luftwaffe is Poland. And I was quite surprised that I hadn't realised it was just the air operation side of it was just 14 days. How did the pilots find the war in Poland? Had it thrown up many surprises for them?
Yeah, well, it's a war. The reality always throws up surprises, but many of them expressed the opinion that it was basically a walk in the park with some small, personal exceptions of people who'd be surprised. But the thing was, they fighter aircraft are 100, 150 miles an hour faster than anything the Poles had. So any lucky shot the Pole got in was really an exception. They did happen. And the Poles were quite well prepared. Most of their frontline aircraft were dispersed right off major airfields and onto small airfields, and they left training aircraft deliberately on the main airfields to be attacked. They knew the Germans were coming because the Poles had a very good intelligence system, as you probably know from the
Enigma.
The Enigma machine came from Poland, basically, the first one. But they didn't have a chance, not in numbers, not in quality of aircraft, but quality of crews, very good.
But the Luftwaffe still lost, I think it was 18%, which seems quite high for such a short campaign.
It is high. Well, this is the reality of combat. If every aircraft shot down by another aircraft, maybe 10 or 20 are taken out in accidents and poor landing conditions and weather and running out of fuel and that sort of thing. On the very first day, there was one unit, I think, they lost 19 aircraft, ran out of fuel because they planned their missions ignoring weather and counter winds and things like that. And the other thing about the Luftwaffe, their entire approach to war, because of the rapid build-up, they had few reserves. The numbers were in the front line rather than having an equal number to back up in reserves. And that was a very big difference between the British and even the French. So the effective casualties of whatever cause would be greater to the Germans because they didn't have the backup to replace them quickly.
And I think Goering's pessimistic about the chances with war in Britain and France. I mean, they were the obvious next target. No, it was obviously going to be the next front. I mean, I wonder how the young pilots felt about that. They lost quite a lot. They must have been aware of their own limitations now in their own supply fronts, or were they are they exuberant on as winners?
Well, yeah, I think by the time they'd conquered France, they were on such a high that nothing really bothered them at all. They thought they were going to walk all over the RAF in a few days. They really believed that. It's the Battle of Britain that brought in some realism and pessimism. But Goering was always pessimistic. When Britain and France declared war, he was very unhappy. And he even expressed the opinion to people that they probably weren't going to win this war. At the end of 1940, one of the Geschwader commanders, one of the best witnesses I had, was invited to an evening dinner in Holland where Goering was present, and this chap was the only sort of line military pilot invited there. And after dinner, somebody asked Goering what happened if the Americans come in, and he just made the signal of drawing his finger across his throat to imply that was it. So even then, and this is in about November, December 1940, Goering was pessimistic about the outcome of the war.
Clearly felt secure in his position to be able to make those statements. I presume if it was a lesser minion, there'd have been obviously taken out and shot, but that might be a bit too literal. But they certainly wouldn't have been holding their positions for very long.
Goering is a very strange personality because in some ways he was very soft, in other ways he was very hard. He was a leading figure in the running and the causes of the Holocaust, for example. And he's the one person that led robbing everyone that was conquered blind and so on, yet his handling of insubordination and his treatment of his air crews was really very soft and very nice. His air crews, right to the end of the war, enjoyed a very high standard of rations, of luxuries, of living conditions. Most units of a reasonable size would have their own transport, U-52, that flew regularly between Germany and wherever they were in the front, just to supply them with coffee and chocolate and those luxury items.
Yeah, that's why I sort of wondered if they were sort of seen as elite troops in that respect. So I kind of got that feeling that where possible they were, they got the best of rations and things.
Yes, certainly the elites in the German forces, it's the tank men and the Air Force pilots and the submarine men. Those are the three definitely seen by themselves and by others as elite forces, yes.
So was the Battle of France for the Luftwaffe, obviously it's longer, was it majorly different? Obviously they're against the RAF. The RAF have certainly got better planes. The French planes are probably still outmatched by the Germans.
The French campaign was much more serious in terms of its effects on the Luftwaffe, I think, than most people realize. The casualties were very, very big. I just need to say first, the Luftwaffe was at its maximum strength for the entire war when the invasion of France started. They never again had that strength to put against anybody. The Russians, whoever they fought against later. So that was the peak of Luftwaffe strength, was on the 10th of May 1940 when they went in. And their casualties were significant. Make no error. I mean, the RAF was basically booted out of France through pressure of losses and just not having the ground organization and backup. The French didn't have such bad planes. The Germans were quite impressed by most of their fighters, but they didn't have the political will or the military leadership will to make them fight properly, all of them together. The French Air Force had good pockets and bad pockets and indifferent pockets, and at times they fought hard, especially after the RAF had largely pulled out from about the 20th of May. The French started fighting much harder, but by then it's a bit late. And the French had many aircraft sitting all over the place, brand new, unused, and pilots to fly them, but they weren't putting the things together. The will to resist and the will to organize was not there at the top. But the German losses in France, especially of bombers, highly significant. If you look on the very first day, the 10th of May, the figures are in the book. I haven't got them right at the top of my head, but they lost something like 120 odd normal aircraft, most of which were bombers, and they lost something like 350 Ju-52 transports in one day. This is 500 aircraft. That's enormous losses. Also, the Ju-52s on the Dutch airfields, they really got shot up in a very, very bad way.
Well, that's something we don't often hear about, the failed attempt by the Germans to capture the Dutch airfields.
I think it was Rotterdam. Rotterdam was the one where they were really caught out because, again, the Dutch and the Belgians had a pretty good idea what was going to happen or what could happen. And Rotterdam airfield was mined by the Dutch in advance. When the Germans came down and they had about, several scores of Ju-52s on the ground already and troops coming up, they just blew the airfield right up. And they had pretty good artillery and troops on the ground, and they really slaughtered the airborne troops, not the paratroopers, but the air-landed troops. And that doesn't normally come out. And in the book, the guy called Victor Milders, who was brother of the famous General of Fighters, he was there, and he gave an eyewitness report of what he saw at Rotterdam. Absolute hundreds of air-landed troops shot in half an hour, basically.
It's funny because we remember Eben Emel, which was essentially the same sort of operation, but it succeeded. But we forget these other operations that were just as bold, that were horrendous failures.
Yes. Well, it's the old story. Nothing is totally defensible. No fort has ever not been conquered in the end, and the same applies to Eben Emel. They put up almost no effective resistance because they weren't equipped or trained for an air landing. What's interesting about the German losses in France is certain bomber units, KG-53 is one that I can remember off the top of my head, that suffered such losses in France that their morale was very bad in the Battle of Britain. The number of serviceable bombers going into the Battle of Britain was about 800-900 out of 1,700-1,800, about 50% serviceability. And that was the effect of the French campaign on the Luftwaffe. It was really much more significant than most people realize.
Well, it seems to be much more attritional than the narrative that we usually hear. I mean, what kind of effect did that have on the pilots?
Well, there'd been heavy casualties. It certainly affected their morale. Quite a few of them were shot down and became prisoners, and they were mostly very badly treated by the French. And that can work two ways, but that's also generally a negative thing. Even if you want revenge afterwards, you're still not the same person that you were. Also, it was the shock of meeting the RAF. For the first time, they were meeting an organized, well-equipped, large force of determined people. And they'd never had that before, not in Poland, not in Spain, not from the French Air Force, not in Denmark or Norway either. And that's a shock many of them talk about across the board almost. It's, Dunkirk, and, well, not just Dunkirk, but from about a week before Dunkirk till the 3rd of June, roughly, they really remark on the quality of the opposition and the losses they suffered, even though their losses were hardly significantly more than the RAF's losses. It was the demoralization of meeting a good quality enemy rather than the number of casualties that they took that impressed them.
Well, I got the feeling as well that they've got 4 or 5 weeks of heavy fighting, and there's no rotation for the pilots, so they must have been flying a number of sorties every day. Presumably they're fighting from ad hoc bases as they move forwards as well.
Yeah. The single engine, the 109 pilots would be moving forward all the time because they and the Stukas and the tank troops were basically close to each other going in all the way. So they were operating all fields and, poor rations, bad landing conditions, and the 109 has a dreadful undercarriage anyway. It has very difficult takeoff because of the torque of the engine and so on. So they were suffering many losses also through the rough field conditions. They just didn't have things their own way in France for the first time. They had successes, but they had failures, they had significant losses. And when they fought the RAF, they were fighting someone that stood up to them and punched back as hard as they got.
You make a point in the book about the RAF over Dunkirk was the first time we get a proper aerial war because they're not combined operations. It's a pure air war, which must have been a wake-up call for both the RAF, presumably, and the Luftwaffe.
Yes, oh, definitely. Yeah, that's almost a strategic war, fighter against fighter, for air superiority. And they were certainly impressed, for sure.
The machines are not, the machines are, if you say comparable, a lot of it comes down to pilot skill from that point in, over Dunkirk, those aerial battles.
Yes, the first time they met the Spitfire. The thing is, all these machine comparisons, you can, all the statistics and things you quote, but that all applies when the machines are brand new. Once they've been used for a few weeks or a few months, then the quoted performance statistics of whatever it is mean nothing anymore, because each aircraft is individual. It basically goes downhill as it gets used. So if a new aircraft meets an older one, it doesn't matter how comparable they really were. But you're quite right, pilot quality is the ultimate. A good pilot in a bad aircraft will normally survive and maybe shoot the other guy down. It's definitely pilot quality.
And this is something that surprised me a lot, that after the Battle of France, the Luftwaffe is thrown sort of straight into the Battle of Britain. The pilots, they're not cycled out and given some R&R. The same pilots from the Battle of France are thrown into the Battle of Britain, so it's pretty non-stop. So that attrition on pilots must have been horrendous, and as you say, comes back to experience and things.
Well, this is the difference between Goering and even the other senior German air leaders and someone like Dowding. Dowding understood in the Battle of Britain, your pilots can only take so much, and you've got to get them out of there and put new people in. Even though your casualty rates will go up by doing that, it's essential for the whole force. Whereas the Luftwaffe always tried to put everything in the basket was on the front line, the whole time. That's a huge difference in command procedure and sensible use of manpower. And you've got to hand it to the RAF in the same way the reserves. They had the reserves because they realized pre-war, whatever the kind of aerial battle, it was a battle of attrition at the end of the day, and they prepared for that. They had the reserves, they had the repair system, and the Germans just looked at the front line. They said, we got 3 or 4 times more aircraft than anyone else, we're going to win. That's almost getting back to what I said in the beginning about high-quality tactics, poor strategy.
Well, this is what came out over the Battle of Britain, which I hadn't sort of appreciated, was that the tactics between the Luftwaffe were expecting one thing of the Battle of Britain, but the RAF didn't play ball, did they? They didn't just go for those dogfights.
No, they didn't. And that's again, Dowding, whatever anyone might say, Dowding was a genius in the way he ran the battle under the circumstances at the time. You can always criticize late, he could have done that, he should have done that. But the fact was he won with fairly minimal resources of largely inexperienced pilots. And as I say, he won. He was outstanding, and Goering wasn't a patch on him.
Tell us, what is the big strategy thing that they did over the big thing was not attacking the bomber, not attacking the fighters, wasn't it?
Well, to me, and a lot of people might disagree with me, it's quite ironic. I mean, Park's strategy, which was totally supported by Dowding, was first to attack the bombers before they got to the target rather than afterwards, even though you could probably knock down more of them afterwards. So it wasn't about scoring the victories, it was about stopping the bombing, number one. Number two, he realized quite clearly, because he was so close to the Germans and they would come in fast, was to go up in small numbers, a squadron at a time. Yeah, and I don't want to get into the whole big wing story either, but there was no time for that. And the offspin, I'm not sure how much Park knew this or not, but certainly the offspin of using a single squadron is it's hard to see wherever it is coming up, even whereas a big bunch of fighters is easy to see, and a smaller number of attacking fighters can get in and out fast before the full strength of the Luftwaffe can react and oppose them. This point to me comes out again and again. It happened in Malta too. When Park took over the defense of Malta, things changed radically. The small numbers for attacking large numbers of bombers and escorting fighters seems to have been a critical point as well.
Well, it struck me as that there's almost a doctrinal thing as well, where the British are not giving medals for shooting down planes. It's quite specifically hit the bombers, where the Germans are just going for kill ratios. They're playing an attritional thing, and that's reinforced through the whole of their system, as you alluded to at the start about giving decorations built on success. It's all numbers.
I sometimes to myself call that the Richthofen Factor from the First World War, because the whole tradition of German fighter pilots rests on Richthofen and his fellow pilots. Richthofen was probably a sociopath, if not worse. He kept the trophy of every single plane he shot down, which is, rather strange behavior. And he awarded himself a silver cup for each one shot down. He had his own jeweler make him cup from himself to himself. This is not normal human behavior. Yet he's the great hero from the First World War, and he's in many ways the tradition everyone looked back to in the Second World War was Richthofen has had it right. And Richthofen was a kill guy. He was a kill rate guy who didn't like getting in the thick of the dogfight. He hung around on the outside, up above, waiting for somebody to leave the dogfight, damaged, running out of fuel, whatever. I think a lot of the fault of the kill fascination of the Luftwaffe can be blamed on that First World War hero. Whereas the British in the First World War, the people who got the VCs and the DSOs and so on most of them were not kill specialists.
No, there's quite a lot handed out for almost endurance.
Yes. Well,
Leonard Cheshire springs to mind. God knows, I can't remember how many hops, 100 hops or something completely ridiculous. Cheshire flew for his VC.
Cheshire should have been killed 20 times over with what he did. If anyone deserved a VC several times over, it was him. So,
most remarkable man.
Yes. Yeah, just to get, if we can pick this up just now, I want to get back to another aspect of the Battle of Britain relating to the tactics the RAF was using. And to me, the ironic thing is the problem that affected the Luftwaffe the worst and was largely responsible, in my opinion, for them going for London in early September was they were running out of 109s. They weren't running out of bombers, they were running out of 109s, because the irony is that Park's focus on attacking bombers forced at least part of the 109s to stick close to the bombers, which they hated, but Goering was right to make them do it to protect the bombers. And that increased 109 losses. By early September, the 109 losses were, in a proportional way, much higher. The rate of 109 losses in the RAF was losing fighters. By the end of September, the Germans were down to about between 250 and 300 fighters. That's all they had left, could operate. And in early September, they were well on the way to reaching those critical limits. And I think, personally, that's one of the main reasons they went for London. Because what's the point of having 1,000 bombers if you can only send 200 in, because that's the amount you can escort. The other 800 are useless. In an ironic way, Park was right to attack the bombers, but the effect that he and no one else could know of or predict was that this was going to cause, after a few weeks, higher 109 losses than the Germans could stand.
Famously, we could replace our own pilots insofar as when a plane came down, hopefully the pilot would get out and he's landing on British soil. So we can retrieve him. And I think at this time we were out producing the Germans with planes as well. So we were actually producing more planes than we were producing pilots. Presumably the Germans had the same problem, but they were just running out of pilots.
No, they were running out of planes too, because you're quite right. The RAF was producing about 500, even 600 fighter planes a month. The Germans were producing 200 to 300. The German economy was not in a war footing until about middle of the war anyway. Typical German, the repair organization had too high a quality. So if a German plane was damaged more than 10%, they have this percentage system of measuring damage, it went back to the factory. So it didn't go to a local workshop or something like that. It went right back to the factory. And you can imagine the logistics of taking a damaged plane. You take it to pieces, you put it on a railway car. It goes through several train, systems before it gets back to Germany from France to Holland and so on. And then the whole return journey. It's an enormous waste of time and effort for a quality differential which is probably insignificant. With the RAF had a lot of local little workshops that could fix a lot of the damage. They just didn't take this. They were prepared to take the, say a 5% loss in efficiency of a repaired plane that's not factory perfect compared to the Germans. So it's a question of approach.
How did the pilots you spoke to, how did they feel about the Battle of Britain?
Well, most of them deny it's a defeat. They say it was a Pyrrhic victory for both sides, or a 50-50% win, which is absolute nonsense. The Germans measured the Battle of Britain from July 1940 to the invasion of Russia on the 22nd of June 1941. That's the Battle of Britain to them. And now it's basically not true, but they will not move on that one, because then the whole thing becomes so strung out that, they can say no one was winning anymore by June on either side, which is true, because the battle was over. No, they have a huge complex about the Battle of Britain. The thing is, the losses there on both sides were to pre-war trained professionals by and large, who are irreplaceable. These people just cannot be replaced. And from there on downwards during the war, these people are lost forever to the system. They're lost to the training system, to passing on experience, to potential command positions, etc., etc. The loss of a pre-war professional is probably 10 times the value you're losing than someone who's trained during the war.
Well, and this comes back to what we were saying before. There seems to be no rotation, so all you're doing is throwing these experienced pilots repeatedly back in. So you're not rotating them out for them to pass on their experience. So your cadre of pilots presumably gets worse and worse and worse as they get less and less experience.
Yes, it does. They were falling out through stress, basically. And a big difference that I don't think many people realize, the RAF had this dreadful system of
LMF.
It's a dreadful system. The Germans had nothing like that. If someone on the German side just couldn't take it anymore, they'd be shipped off quietly to, a training post or a desk job or something like that. And none of this LMF type treatment, which I think was that's a blot on the RAF's copybook. In many ways, a moral blot. But
I once chatted to a guy. I was at a talk for a guy from Tony Eriksson who'd been a pilot in Bomber Command, and someone asked him about coping with stress, and he said, "Well, in my day, stress to us was what we'd put on the wings when we flew hard."
Yes. Yeah, he was with 617 Squadron, wasn't he?
Yes, that rings a bell. He was on the raid that sank or didn't sink the
Tirpitz.
Yes, Tirpitz.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Germans also had their pilot replacement problems, just like the British. They sort of, by about September already, were pushing in youngsters to replace losses in the units who had minimal experience of anything and who got shot down very rapidly. They had exactly the same problems. And in fact, their pilot reserves were smaller than the RAF's pilot reserves. But the RAF never really had that much of a pilot shortage. It was a shortage of experienced pilots who could survive. It's a critical difference. What's the use of having 100 people if they each last 2 days before they get shot down?
Yeah, I couldn't believe how much difference that. I can't remember. There is you do mention it in the book, but about how the difference that experience makes to survival was amazing.
Yes, it is. It's huge. In my job, I reckon after about 12 years, I knew roughly what I was doing in my job. It's the same with any activity you undertake. It takes you a while before you're any use at all. Before that, you're just a danger to yourself and everyone around you. It's cannon fodder. These poor people, they went in inexperienced. They didn't have a hope at all.
Well, and it's this point the tables are turned on the Germans insofar as it's almost the Battle of Britain in reverse when the British start then their bombing raids and the Luftwaffe is operating over its own territory.
Yes, yes. It was. The tactics they used was almost exactly Park's tactics. They used the small formations too. They could have put 50, 60 fighters in one formation and hit a sweep, but that they would use 20 at the most, normally 12, 14, 16, something like that. So they rapidly learned that lesson. The whole operations of the RAF in 1941 and 42 were really a waste of time and resources. They were losing significantly more, 3 or 4 times more aircraft and probably 2 or 3 times more pilots than the Germans. And what did they achieve from it? They didn't achieve air superiority or anything, anywhere.
Could any of it be put down to a learning process?
Yeah, but the experience you gain when you're losing hundreds of pilots a year, I'm not sure that you're not losing more than you're actually gaining. I just think that's bad strategy.
So what was the turning point for the raids on by the RAF and I guess later the American Air Force? What was the turning point that made them successful?
You mean right through the war?
Well, if you said those first couple of years were a waste of time, what was the thing that made them not a waste of time? What did they learn that turned the tables?
Well, in 1941 and 1942, the British bomber formations coming in were tiny, 9 plenarms or 6 plenarms, and the amount of bombs they're carrying light bombs, the individual bombs, they do almost no damage. The targets are limited to the range of the Spitfire, which is a very small part of northern France. Nothing critical is getting damaged that really hits the German war effort or their manufacturing. So they could afford to treat that like a training exercise for the Luftwaffe, and they did. They had a wonderful time, and for the experienced German aces, this was lovely. This was putting on a plate given to them daily. Everybody from the controllers to the pilots to the mechanics all got wonderful experience and no pressure, because if they didn't intercept the sweep with 9 Blenheim, so what? The damage done was minimal.
So the big change is when they start on these big bomber raids with the 1,000 bomber raids sort of things with the big Lancasters and the B-17s. That was the big change that put them on the back foot.
American bomber attacks started to become significant in about mid-1943. They only started going for Germany itself at the beginning of 1943, and they started mainly on the northern part of Germany, close by the ports and so on. And then they gradually went further and further inland. By about the middle of 1943, they were starting to hurt the Germans. But the thing is, they were taking enormous losses themselves. And then the Germans had no choice but to defend. And this is a new mindset for the average Luftwaffe fighter pilot, because their whole psyche, their whole methodology was based on the attack, on attacking with fighters, enemy aircraft, and shooting them down, the kill rate. That entire thing fell apart with the bombers, because you couldn't have a simple attack and shoot down a fighter, which is relatively easy. Shooting down a B-17 is a whole different ballgame, because you've got to make either a lot of attacks, or you've got to attack with very heavy weaponry, which makes your plane less maneuverable and so on. It's being forced to attack bomber formations, which is something they'd never really done on the large scale.
I hadn't appreciated how much of a problem the B-17 was for the Luftwaffe to shoot down.
It was a huge problem. The machine guns that the Americans used, the 50 caliber machine gun, it has an effective range of about, not accurate, but an effective range of about 1,500 yards. Whereas your fighter is wasting its time if it opens up much less than about 300 yards distance on the B-17. So it's got to travel about 1,200 yards under fire from 10, 20, 50, 100 B-17s to even get into a shooting position. And your youngsters and inexperienced pilots they're not going to do that. They're going to open fire at 500 or 600 yards, chicken out and pull away. It's just human nature. That's why they created the head-on attack as a speciality, because that really worked.
But this is quite contentious, this head-on attack, isn't it? The Goering wasn't for it.
Goering was against it because a head-on attack will normally produce fewer casualties to the enemy, but it produces very few casualties to your own side. So the proportionate loss gain is much higher, whereas attacking from the rear will probably shoot down twice the number of American bombers, but you'll lose 3 or 4 times the number of your own fighters that you would have lost from a head-on attack. So Goering, in his normal insensitive way, didn't care. He just wanted the American bombers to fall out the sky. The fact that it cost his own pilots didn't really bother him at that level. At an individual level, he felt sorry for the pilots and looked after them. He had to be able to report through his ego and to satisfy Hitler that he knocked down 50 or 60 American bombers. It was a huge problem to them. And the thing is, a head-on attack is a very difficult thing to do. It's very fast. The closing speeds are 600-700 miles an hour in some cases, depending who's doing what speed. Effectively, you can't come in with more than about 8 fighters at a time, because otherwise they start getting in each other's way and shooting each other down. So they would come in as 4 or 8 fighters at a time, head-on attack from slightly above, head-on and slightly above. And if they hit an American bomber in the cockpit, that was it, basically. Whether they damaged it severely or not doesn't matter. Once you've taken out the 2 pilots and wounded them, it's basically over.
As you say, there's an argument again over small wings and big wings for attacks, and wasn't Goering more keen on the larger wing attack than the smaller wing attack, which had proved more successful.
Definitely, yeah. That's where these the Sturmgruppe or company front attack. It's a difficult word to translate into English, but which is not in this first volume, but it's in the latter part of the Battle of Germany, when they came up with a system of having an entire group of 40, 50, even 60 planes coming in a V formation, a huge V formation from behind, in heavily armored, normally Focke-Wulf 190s. So heavy armor and heavy weaponry as well, .30 millimeter cannons and rockets and things like that. And they just close in from the back under fire and blast them from as close as they could get in, which is really a sort of infantry style attack in many ways.
Yeah, and then not help, I presume, by the end of 43, the long-range escort fighters start to come on stream as well.
Well, that's what made all the difference. Before that, the Germans were winning. I mean, in August 1943 at Schweinfurt, and again in October, the two raids on Schweinfurt on the ball bearing plants. Each time they lost 60 bombers shot down, and probably almost an equal number scrapped or seriously damaged in the UK. Those were impossible losses. They were, 40-50% of the formations they were sending up. Basically, the 8th Air Force, the US 8th Air Force, stopped serious raiding until they got the Mustang, even in small numbers. So the Mustang was absolutely crucial to win the Battle of Germany. Without it, the Battle of Germany was being won by the Germans, and at best, it was a draw. And you couldn't have had the invasion with that situation.
I was at a US Air Base, ex-US Air Base museum in Cambridgeshire, and I was talking to one of the staff there. I said, "Oh, I think that's the Mustang flying over." And there's a guy locally who apparently owns a Mustang, and he said, "Let's go out and wave." And we waved, and he came round again. He said, "Quick, run down!" And we ran down to what was just a field now, but what had been the old runway. And the guy dropped the Mustang down to about tree height and shot down in front of us, about 30, 40 yards in front of us. It was just the most absolutely breathtakingly remarkable sight.
Yes.
Wonderful plane.
The Mustang was an absolute war winner, and almost by accident. I'm sure you know the story with the Merlin engine. That was almost an accident that didn't happen. And without the Merlin engine, the Mustang would never have made any kind of difference at all to the Battle of Germany. It's a low altitude rated fighter with the old engine. So the Mustang is definitely the most critical aspect of the Allies winning the Battle of Germany. And that made the invasion possible. Without air superiority invasion, the risk would have been much too great.
How did the Luftwaffe pilots feel about the Mustang?
They were scared of it, basically, because it had the range to be almost anywhere. It had a performance at least equal, and in some aspects superior to their own fighters. It was heavily armed. It had 6.50 caliber machine guns, and the American pilots were very aggressive. They shot German pilots on their parachutes in fair numbers. There's no getting away from that. It's an uncomfortable truth, perhaps for many people, but it's the truth. I've got probably 10 or 15 pilots who personally either experienced that or saw it happening to their friends. So all of these things combined, they were very scared of the Mustang. And also the Thunderbolt was also a dangerous fighter. And the big thing about the American fighters, they were heavier, significantly heavier, even the Mustang, than the 109 and the FW-190. And the standard German breaker, which they'd been used to the entire war up till then, was to dive away out of trouble. And the 109 especially could outdive anything until the American fighters appeared. And that was a huge shock to them, because then they had no choice. They had to turn into the attack and fight them. Because if they dived away, they were finished. Because the Mustang could easily outdive them and catch them, no problem at all.
It had a higher ceiling as well, didn't it?
Yes, Mustang. It had everything. It had a high ceiling, it had the range, it had the performance, it had the armament. You name it, it had it. By the time the Mustang appeared, the Germans they were using two sorts of fighters, heavily armored and armed fighters to attack the bombers, normally the Focke-Wulf, and then lightly armed 109s with altitude performance to take on the escort fighters. So, and the Americans didn't care which lot they met, because they could take them on equally. That's a losing situation. You can't win that sort of situation from the German point of view. And their pilots, the experienced pilots, were getting killed all the time. The Battle of Germany started in August 1942, and it went through to the end of the war. That's years. And the attrition of experienced pilots and leaders is enormous.
There's the quote from, is it Shotto Stamberger in the book, who said, old pilots suffer from stomach cramps and could not eat. Presumably, I don't know, if you've been in from the start, you've been very lucky. Even those old pilots must be...
I met a Luftwaffe pilot here in South Africa. After the war, come to South Africa and settled here. He got stuck in the German training system, and he collected 3,000 hours of experience before he saw combat for the first time in about autumn 1944. So he was a highly experienced pilot, but he had no combat experience. And he told me he was only in action for about 2-3 months. And he said at breakfast every morning, when they came into the mess, and the Germans, the officers and NCOs, lived in the same mess and ate at the same table. Under every chair was a bottle of cognac at breakfast. And he said that's basically what the guys would have for breakfast: cognac, coffee, and a cigarette or a cigar of some sort, because they couldn't handle food. And that's how they took off. And on the RAF side too, let's face it, there were a lot more pilots got into cockpits with a good, hefty amount of courage on board, more than many people would think. Plus, of course, the bomber pilots with their barbiturates that were issued to keep them awake. It really doesn't bear thinking about this kind of thing.
Well, it does make you wonder how some of them even survived the war. Towards the end, they're outgunned and they're outnumbered. There has been no let-up in operations for them, from 1939. There's not much of a respite.
That's one of these stories that it's difficult to quantify, but, the pilots I had to deal with, quite a few of them did get rest periods. There was no tour system in the Luftwaffe like the RAF or the American Air Force. But they did rest a lot of pilots. Not all, but a lot of units and a lot of commanders made sure that their people, in fact, did get rest periods, even though it wasn't an official tour based on 200 combat hours or anything like that. About, I would say, 30 or 40% of the people I talked to did get rest, and about 20% didn't, and the rest didn't comment on that. It is a great truth that many Luftwaffe pilots didn't get much rest. Others did. I have no quantifiable data to say what the proportion might have been, but for example, the guy on the cover of the book, the one with the spots all over his face, he flew about 13 months in action in JG1 on basically in the area of Holland, from about mid-42 to mid-43, and then he had 6 months at a training facility, and then he went back in for his second tour, and he only lasted about 4 weeks on that before he was badly injured. So there's a case in point. 30 months on, 6 months off, back on the second tour. And there's quite a few others like that. And when they were finished and they couldn't fly anymore, then they were normally shipped off to a safe job quietly without any, sort of fanfare or proceedings or anything like that.
The stuff they went. It did amuse me that one of the guys when they were right at the end, when they're short on, that's not necessarily so much planes, but fuel, he gets reposted as ground troops. And
quite a few of these guys did end up as ground troops. Of course, they didn't have a clue how to fight on the ground, and quite a few of them got killed. A lot of the ground crews went that way, and the NCO pilots. This is the one place where the NCOs were discriminated against. At the end of the war, they would go into the paratroopers and just ordinary infantry, and the officers, by and large, were not sent on that route. And that's a horrible way to end the war. Get killed in some stupid ground battle in a hopeless situation on the Eastern Front anyway.
The drain and the attrition of it all just is what strikes me every time, and it all comes back to this lack of experience. And when you get it, the chances of you hanging on to it, it's almost lucky if you get shot down and are injured.
Yeah, oh yes, definitely. The Luftwaffe also maintained quite a few rest centers all over the place. And when someone just got too tired, they'd get stuck in there on some watery medical excuse just to get them out of things for a month, 2 months. Just rest centers where they could, be in a quiet country area where they wouldn't get disturbed, they get good food and just rest and away from everything. So they were aware of the problem. The Germans tend to formalize everything. So if there's no formal system, like having a tour, then they don't really know what to do, how to handle the situation.
Patrick, that was great. Thank you. We'll leave it there. Patrick's book is Alarmstart, the German fighter pilot's experience in the Second World War. Not only is it packed full of the experiences of the Luftwaffe pilots themselves, but it's complemented with some very interesting statistical information. I'll put a link on the website. I think we're remaining in the air for the next episode, looking at bomber crews over Burma. That may change as I've not yet recorded it, but to keep abreast of what's happening with the podcast and to find out more World War II stuff, don't forget you can find me on Facebook. Give the page a like, WW2 Podcast. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.